When the Boeing 737 touched down at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on the evening of November 17, 1989, the crew reported nothing unusual about their flight from Denver. The passengers disembarked without incident. Ground crew prepared the aircraft for its next rotation. But when flight operations cross-referenced the arrival time with departure logs, radar data, and fuel consumption records, they discovered something that would remain unexplained for decades. According to every instrument, every timestamp, and every calculation, the flight had taken 90 minutes longer than physically possible given the aircraft's position throughout the journey. The morning of November 17, 1989, began as unremarkably as any other Friday at Denver's Stapleton International Airport. Flight 501, a scheduled commercial service operated by a regional carrier, was cleared for departure at Aero 947 Mountain Standard Time. The aircraft, registration November 732 Papa Bravo, was a Boeing 737-300 that had entered service 14 months earlier. It carried a standard passenger load of 89 souls, along with a crew of 6. The captain had logged over 12,000 hours, the first officer just under 7,000. Both had flown this particular route more than 200 times between them, Denver to Dallas, a routine southbound corridor that thousands of commercial flights traverse every month. The filed flight plan indicated a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 53 minutes, and fuel sufficient for the route plus standard reserves. Weather conditions across the flight path were clear. No convective activity, no turbulence advisories. Winds aloft were light and variable, offering neither significant headwind nor tailwind component. By every measure, this was a textbook operation. The 737 lifted off runway 35 right at 0952 local time, 5 minutes behind schedule due to gate congestion. Initial climb was normal. Denver departure handed the flight off to Denver Center at 1004, by which time the aircraft had reached flight level 230 and was continuing its climb. At 1009, the crew checked in with Kansas City Center, reporting level at flight level 370. Ground speed, as calculated by air traffic control radar, was 462 knots. The controller acknowledged and instructed the flight to maintain heading and altitude. Everything proceeded according to standard operating procedure. At 10:37 Mountain Standard Time, Kansas City Center attempted routine communication with Flight 501. There was no response. The controller repeated the call, still nothing. A third attempt using the emergency frequency. Silence. On the controller's radar scope, the transponder return for November 732 Papa Bravo was gone. The primary radar target, which requires no cooperation from the aircraft's systems and simply reflects radio waves off the aircraft's metal structure, was also absent. The Boeing 737, along with 95 people, had vanished from controlled airspace. Standard protocols initiated immediately. Kansas City Center contacted adjacent sectors to determine if the aircraft had drifted into another controller's airspace without authorization. Negative. They checked for transponder failure or frequency error. Negative. They contacted Denver Center and Fort Worth Center to triangulate any possible radar contact. Negative. The controller issued an alert notice. Rescue coordination centers were notified. Military radar installations were queried for any unknown or unidentified targets along the projected flight path. Nothing matched the missing aircraft's position, heading, or altitude. At 11:52 Central Standard Time, 75 minutes after losing contact, Fort Worth Center received an unexpected radio transmission. It was Flight 501, requesting clearance for descent into Dallas-Fort Worth. The controller, who had been briefed on the missing aircraft, responded immediately, asking the crew to confirm their position and altitude. The captain reported level at flight level 370, 83 nautical miles north of the airport, inbound on the published arrival route. His voice was calm. He sounded routine. He provided no indication that anything irregular had occurred. Fort Worth Center issued descent clearance and asked the crew to confirm their last communication time. The captain responded that their previous check-in had been with Kansas City Center approximately 40 minutes prior. The controller did not correct him. Instead, she notified her supervisor and continued handling the flight according to standard procedures. The 737 descended without incident, entered the terminal area, and landed on runway 17 left at 12:17 Central Standard Time. Total flight time from takeoff to touchdown, 2 hours and 25 minutes. For a flight that should have taken 1 hour and 53 minutes, this represented a discrepancy of 32 minutes. But that figure only measured elapsed time according to clocks on the ground. When investigators began examining the sequence of events, they discovered that the real anomaly was far more specific. The aircraft had disappeared from radar at 10:37 Mountain Time. It had reappeared at 11:52 Central Time. Mountain Time and Central Time differ by 1 hour. Adjusting for the zone difference, the aircraft had been absent from all radar coverage, all radio contact, and all tracking systems for exactly 90 minutes. The flight crew was interviewed separately within 6 hours of landing. Both pilots described a completely normal flight. Neither reported any equipment malfunction, unusual weather, navigation error, or communication difficulty. According to their recollection, they had maintained continuous contact with air traffic control throughout the entire flight. They checked in with Denver Departure, Denver Center, and Kansas City Center without any irregularity. When asked specifically about the period between 10:37 and 11:52, both pilots stated they were in routine cruise flight, monitoring instruments, and making standard position reports. Neither had any memory of a communication gap or radar dropout. The flight attendants reported nothing unusual. Passenger service proceeded normally, no turbulence, no sudden maneuvers, no announcements from the cockpit regarding any abnormality. Several passengers were interviewed in the days following the flight. None reported anything out of the ordinary. A businessman in seat 12C recalled looking at his watch during the descent into Dallas and noting that the flight was taking slightly longer than usual, but attributed this to headwinds or routing. A woman in seat 22F mentioned that the in-flight service seemed compressed, as though the crew was hurrying, but she thought nothing of it at the time. The aircraft's cockpit voice recorder retained only the final 30 minutes of audio, per the technology standard of that era. The recording showed normal crew communication, checklists, and approach procedures. Nothing suggested distress, confusion, or awareness of any anomaly. The flight data recorder, which captured multiple parameters including altitude, airspeed, heading, and engine performance, told a more complicated story. According to the data, the aircraft had maintained a consistent flight profile throughout the journey. No deviations in altitude, no course changes beyond those consistent with the filed flight plan. Fuel flow remained steady and appropriate for cruise conditions. But when engineers calculated total fuel consumption based on the recorded data, they found that the aircraft had burned exactly the amount of fuel consistent with a flight time of 1 hour and 53 minutes, not 2 hours and 25 minutes. At cruise altitude, a Boeing 737-300 burns approximately 3,400 pounds of fuel per hour. For an additional 32 minutes of flight time, the aircraft should have consumed an extra 1,800 pounds. The fuel logs showed no such discrepancy. The amount of fuel remaining in the tanks at landing matched precisely what would be expected after a flight of standard duration. 3 separate radar facilities had tracked the flight during different phases. Denver Center's data showed the aircraft climbing and proceeding on course until 2009, at which point it was handed off to Kansas City Center. Kansas City Center's data showed the aircraft on their scopes from 2009 until 1037, at which point the target disappeared. Fort Worth Center's data showed no target matching the aircraft's transponder code or projected position until 11:52, when it suddenly appeared exactly where it should have been if it had been flying continuously and uninterrupted since departure. There was no gap in the flight path. The aircraft did not deviate. It simply ceased to exist on radar for 90 minutes, then resumed as though nothing had occurred. The Airline Pilots Association assigned an investigator to interview the crew in greater detail. The captain was questioned about his recollection of specific radio calls, navigational checkpoints, and crew coordination during the flight. He described each phase with precision and consistency. He recalled checking in with Kansas City Center. He remembered making a position report over a specific navigation fix. He described looking at the weather radar, which showed clear conditions ahead. He mentioned a brief conversation with the first officer about fuel efficiency. All of these recollections appeared genuine. He was not evasive. He did not appear confused. He simply had no awareness that anything unusual had happened. The first officer's account matched the captain's in every material detail. When asked if there had been any period during the flight when he felt disoriented, lost track of time, or experienced any cognitive disruption, he said no. When asked if he had noticed any anomalies with the aircraft's instruments, he said no. When asked if he had observed anything outside the aircraft windows that seemed out of place, he said no. The flight, from his perspective, had been as routine as any of the hundreds he had flown before. Investigators examined the possibility of a navigation error that might have caused the aircraft to fly a longer route than planned, thereby explaining the extended flight time. But the radar data, limited as it was, showed the aircraft tracking along its filed route without deviation. Additionally, the fuel consumption data ruled out any significant deviation in distance traveled. The aircraft had flown the expected distance while consuming fuel consistent with that distance, yet had somehow required 32 minutes longer to do so, while simultaneously disappearing from all radar and radio contact for 90 minutes. Another hypothesis considered was a systems failure that caused the aircraft's transponder and radios to simultaneously malfunction, rendering it invisible to air traffic control, while the crew remained unaware of the problem. But this theory failed to explain why the aircraft's position, when it reappeared, was exactly where it should have been based on continuous flight. If the crew had been flying without ground contact, they would have had no way to correct for winds, navigation drift, or timing without access to air traffic control instructions. Yet the aircraft appeared on radar at precisely the correct geographic position and altitude for its flight plan. The possibility of a radar system failure was examined extensively. Could all 3 radar facilities, along with multiple backup systems and military installations, have somehow failed to detect the aircraft for the same 90-minute period. Engineers reviewed equipment logs, maintenance records, and system performance data. Every radar installation had been operating normally. There were no gaps in coverage. Other aircraft in the same airspace had been tracked continuously throughout the same time period. The failure was specific to Flight 501 alone. The Federal Aviation Administration opened a formal investigation. Interviews were conducted with every controller who had handled or attempted to handle the flight. The Kansas City Center controller who lost radar contact described the moment the target vanished. One sweep of the radar antenna, the target was there. The next sweep, 12 seconds later, it was gone, not faded, not intermittent, simply absent, as cleanly as if it had never existed. The controller stated she had never seen a target disappear in that manner in 14 years of experience. Aircraft that crash show a descending target before vanishing. Aircraft with transponder failures still produce a primary radar return. This target had done neither. Meteorological data for the flight path and time period was reviewed in exhaustive detail. Temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed, wind direction, cloud cover, precipitation, convective activity, and turbulence reports were analyzed. Atmospheric conditions were benign. There were no phenomena present that could account for unusual radar propagation, radio interference, or navigation anomalies. The atmosphere along the flight path was stable and unremarkable. The investigation expanded to include the aircraft's maintenance history. November 732. Papa Bravo had accumulated just over 3,000 flight hours since entering service. It had undergone all scheduled inspections. No chronic mechanical issues, no deferred maintenance items, no squawks related to navigation, communication, or electrical systems. After landing in Dallas, the aircraft underwent an unscheduled inspection that found every system functioning normally. Radios tested normally, transponder tested normally, navigation equipment tested normally, flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder both retrieved and analyzed without difficulty. One detail emerged during the inspection that initially seemed insignificant. The aircraft's chronometers, both the captain's and first officer's panel clocks, were found to be running approximately 2 minutes fast compared to coordinated universal time. This is not unusual. Cockpit clocks drift gradually and are periodically reset by crews. But when maintenance personnel asked the captain when he had last reset his clock, he stated that he had synchronized it with the gate clock before departure that morning. Gate clocks at major airports are synchronized to atomic time and are highly accurate. If the captain's clock had been correctly set at 0947 and was running 2 minutes fast by 1217, this would suggest a drift rate far higher than normal for that type of timepiece. The flight attendants were re-interviewed and asked specific questions about the timing of their service. The lead flight attendant stated that she had begun beverage service approximately 15 minutes after reaching cruising altitude, which would have been around 10:25. She recalled that the service felt rushed and that she had to expedite the cart through the cabin more quickly than usual. When asked why, she said it felt like there was less time than normal before the descent. She could not explain this sensation more precisely, but noted that she had checked her watch several times during the service and felt surprised at how quickly time seemed to be passing. A passenger in seat 8B, a pilot for another airline traveling off-duty, was located and interviewed 3 weeks after the flight. He stated that he had been monitoring the flight's progress casually and had noted that the aircraft seemed to be making good time. He recalled looking at his watch during cruise and calculating that they would arrive slightly early. But when the descent began, he checked his watch again and was surprised to see that they were descending more or less on schedule, not early. He attributed this to a mental error on his part and thought nothing more of it until he was contacted by investigators. The official investigation concluded after 7 months. The final report, which was not widely distributed, stated that Flight 501 had experienced a temporary loss of radar and radio contact due to undetermined causes, but that the flight had proceeded safely and landed without incident. The report noted the discrepancy between elapsed clock time and fuel consumption, but offered no explanation. It stated that the crew had performed their duties appropriately and that no equipment malfunction had been identified. The report recommended no changes to procedures, equipment, or training. It was filed and archived. No public statement was issued. The incident did not meet the criteria for mandatory reporting under aviation safety regulations because no safety of flight issue had been identified. The aircraft had not deviated from its intended flight path. No emergency had been declared. No injuries had occurred. The passengers were unaware that anything unusual had happened. Within the regulatory framework, the flight was categorized as routine. The crew continued flying. The captain retired 8 years later after a full career. The first officer eventually upgraded to captain and flew for another 16 years. Neither ever experienced a similar incident. In interviews conducted years later, both maintained that Flight 501 had been a completely normal flight and expressed puzzlement at why investigators had found anything worthy of inquiry. The aircraft, November 732 Papa Bravo, remained in service for another 19 years. It flew over 42,000 additional flight hours without any recurrence of unusual behavior. It was eventually retired and sold to a leasing company, then operated by 2 different carriers in South America before being permanently grounded and scrapped in 2014. Maintenance records from its entire service life showed nothing that could explain the events of November 17, 1989. Over the years, several aviation safety researchers and independent investigators have attempted to explain what occurred. Theories have ranged from classified military radar testing to atmospheric propagation anomalies to synchronized equipment failure across multiple redundant systems. None have provided a satisfactory explanation that accounts for all the documented facts. The simultaneous loss of primary and secondary radar contact, combined with the crew's complete lack of awareness, combined with normal fuel consumption despite extended elapsed time, remains unexplained. One FAA official, speaking off the record in 2003, stated that similar incidents had been reported on at least 3 other occasions involving commercial flights over the continental United States, but that none had been formally investigated because they did not meet safety reporting thresholds. This statement was never confirmed. No records of these alleged incidents have been located in publicly accessible databases. Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers have produced no additional documentation. In 2011, a retired air traffic controller who had been working at Kansas City Center on November 17, 1989, published a brief account of the incident in an aviation safety newsletter. He described watching the target disappear and the confusion that followed. He stated that supervisors had instructed controllers not to discuss the incident and that a representative from an unspecified government agency had visited the facility 2 days later to review tapes and interview personnel. He noted that the tapes from that day were never returned to the facility. and that no explanation was ever provided to the controllers involved. The passengers from Flight 501, to the extent they could be located and contacted years later, remembered nothing unusual about the flight. Several did not remember the flight at all, which is not surprising given the passage of time and the routine nature of the journey. Those who did recall flying that day described it as entirely unremarkable. One passenger mentioned that she had been worried about making a tight connection in Dallas, but that the flight had arrived on time, allowing her to catch her next flight without difficulty. The Boeing company was provided with technical details of the incident and asked to comment on possible explanations related to aircraft systems or design. Their response stated that the 737-300 systems, as described in the incident report, had functioned normally, and that the aircraft's performance was consistent with normal operations. They noted that the fuel consumption data indicated routine cruise flight, and that no systems aboard the aircraft could account for the radar and radio anomalies. Several academic researchers specializing in atmospheric physics and radar propagation have reviewed the meteorological and radar data. None have identified any known atmospheric phenomenon that would cause simultaneous loss of primary and secondary radar contact over such an extended period while leaving the aircraft's position unchanged. Anomalous propagation, which can cause radar targets to appear in incorrect locations or disappear briefly, does not typically last for 90 minutes and does not affect radio communication in the same manner as radar detection. The navigation coordinates logged by the flight data recorder were compared against the filed flight plan and expected position calculations. The aircraft's track over the ground matched the intended route within normal navigation tolerances. There was no indication of deviation, holding patterns, or course changes that would account for additional flight time. The aircraft flew from Denver to Dallas in a straight line at the expected speed, burning the expected amount of fuel while somehow requiring both 1 hour and 53 minutes and 2 hours and 25 minutes to complete the journey, depending on which measurement system is consulted. One engineer who reviewed the case noted that if the crew's perception of time was used as the reference, the flight lasted 1 hour and 53 minutes. If ground-based clocks and radar data are used as the reference, the flight lasted 2 hours and 25 minutes, but with a 90-minute gap in observed continuity. He stated that he could construct no physical model that reconciled these observations without invoking measurement errors on a scale that seemed implausible given the redundancy of timing systems involved. The flight data recorder's internal clock, which timestamps each data point, showed no discontinuities. The timestamps progressed normally from takeoff to landing. When these timestamps were compared to air traffic control recordings and radar timestamps, the discrepancy became apparent. According to the aircraft's instruments, less time had passed than according to ground-based systems. The difference was not a matter of seconds or minutes due to clock drift. It was a systematic offset that appeared in every independent timing system on the ground, while remaining absent from every system aboard the aircraft. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker attempted to produce a program about the incident. He contacted surviving crew members, passengers, and investigators. Most declined to participate. Those who agreed to speak provided consistent accounts that matched the official record, but offered no new insights. The documentary was never completed. The filmmaker stated in an interview that the lack of dramatic elements and the absence of any clear resolution made the story unsuitable for the format he had intended. The case remains in aviation archives as an unresolved incident. It is occasionally cited in discussions of unexplained radar anomalies, but it has not generated significant ongoing research or investigation. The crew experienced no trauma, the passengers experienced no harm, the aircraft functioned normally. By every measure that matters for aviation safety, the flight was a success. Yet the gap remains. 90 minutes during which a Boeing 737 carrying 95 people existed in a state that could be measured by those aboard, but not observed by anyone on the ground. When Flight 501 reappeared on radar at 11:52, the Fort Worth Center controller who received the transmission noted in her log that the target had resumed tracking, not appeared or established contact, but resumed, as though the flight had been continuous and the break had been in observation only. This terminology is standard for situations where radar contact is temporarily lost and then regained. But in this case, what resumed was not merely detection, it was correspondence. The aircraft was where it should have been, as though it had never stopped being there, even though every instrument confirmed it had not been there at all. Decades later, the question that remains is not what happened to the aircraft. The aircraft landed safely. The question is what happened to the 90 minutes. They elapsed for everyone on the ground. They did not elapse for anyone in the air. The fuel did not burn, the distance did not extend. The crew did not age those extra minutes any more than the passengers did. But the time passed nonetheless, measured and recorded and verified by multiple independent sources that could not all have been wrong in the same way at the same time. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.